The auction yard lay at the edge of town where the dirt never quite settled and the air always carried the stink of old sweat and cheaper liquor. Rough wooden fences circled the open ground like tired guards, their splintered rails scarred by years of leaning men and restless animals. Caleb Hart stood near the back, half in shadow, his hat pulled low not to hide his face but his thoughts. He hadn't planned to come. He told himself that twice while he watched the crowd gather, yet his boots had carried him here all the same. Word traveled fast in places like this, especially when desperation was involved. A drunk was selling his daughter's labor contract. A grown girl this time, not a child, which made people feel better about it even if it shouldn't have. Caleb had heard the name, Eli Moore, and the familiar ache of anger had followed. Lonely men learn to recognize certain sounds. The hollow laugh of someone who'd already lost everything, the greedy murmur of those who smelled profit, the silence of the one being traded. She stood on the platform when Caleb finally saw her clearly. Not cowering, not defiant, just still. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, fingers marked with old calluses. Dust clung to the hem of her faded dress. A thin cord hung around her neck, holding a small wooden tag. The word deaf was scratched into it in uneven letters, darkened with charcoal so no one could miss it. The men missed nothing. Their voices rose and fell, crude jokes tossed carelessly in her direction, spoken loudly as if volume could replace courage. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. He watched her eyes instead of her face. They didn't dart or flinch the way frightened eyes did. They observed, measured, gray-blue and sharp, like a blade kept carefully sheathed. Eli Moore lurched forward, nearly losing his balance as he grabbed the edge of the platform. His beard was matted, his coat stained with old spills. He raised the bottle in his hand as if it were proof of ownership. "She don't talk," he announced, words slurring together. "Can't hear worth a damn. But she works. Strong as any man. Don't ask questions, don't argue back." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Caleb shifted his weight, anger pulsing hot and steady in his chest. He told himself he was here to stop something worse. He told himself that buying the contract was different from condoning the trade. It was a thin line, but it was the one he had. The bidding opened low, insultingly low. A trader with thick wrists and a scarred chin raised his hand, eyes never leaving the girl. Another followed. The numbers crept upward, slow and casual, like they had all the time in the world. Caleb stepped forward before he could overthink it. "I'll take it," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Fair price. Right now." The crowd turned. A few brows lifted. Someone scoffed. "What's a lonely rancher want with a deaf girl?" A man called out. Caleb didn't answer. He named a price that made Eli Moore's eyes widen, greed briefly sobering him. The gavel came down with a dull crack of finality. Just like that, it was over. Paperwork followed, ink smearing slightly as hands shook, Eli's from drink, the clerk's from indifference. Caleb signed his name with deliberate care. When it was done, he stepped around the table and approached the platform. The girl hadn't moved, only her eyes tracked him. Caleb removed his hat and knelt so he was level with her, making sure his face was fully in her line of sight. He spoke slowly, gently, his hands open, palms up, as if that alone could signal safety. "My name is Caleb," he said, enunciating each word. He didn't know if she read lips, but he hoped tone mattered. "You're coming with me, not to be hurt, not to be sold again." She studied him, not with fear, but with a careful attention that made him acutely aware of every word he chose next. "You'll have food," he continued. "A room, work if you want it. No chains, no lock on your door unless you put it there yourself." For a moment, nothing changed. Then she nodded once. Small, controlled. Caleb stood and turned away from the platform without looking back at Eli Moore. He hitched his wagon himself, ignoring the stares that followed. When he helped her up beside him, he was careful not to touch her unless necessary. She climbed easily, settling on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, spine straight. The road out of town stretched long and pale beneath the afternoon sun. Caleb clicked his tongue softly, and the horse started forward. He spoke as they rode, pointing to landmarks as they passed. The creek that cut through the land like a silver scar, the distant line of cottonwoods, the barn roof barely visible against the hills. He didn't know why he talked. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was hope. She watched everything, the land, the sky, him, when she thought he wasn't looking. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun was dipping low, painting the fields gold. Caleb felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, something like responsibility and something like relief tangled together. He showed her the house first, small but solid, then the barn, then finally the spare room. Clean, simple, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a lamp on the table, a door with a latch on the inside. You can lock it, he said softly, touching the latch so she'd understand. Anytime. She nodded again. Caleb hesitated at the doorway, unsure what else to say. Words felt thin in the face of everything she'd been through. He tipped his hat slightly and turned to leave. That was when he heard it. Thank you. The word was quiet but clear, spoken with careful effort, like something practiced only when absolutely necessary. Caleb stopped so abruptly his heart seemed to stumble with him. He turned slowly. She stood just inside the room, one hand resting on the doorframe. Her expression was guarded, but there was no mistaking the awareness in her eyes. You can hear?" Caleb asked, barely trusting his own voice. She hesitated, then nodded. "Some," she said. "Not all. Not always. Enough." Caleb leaned a shoulder against the wall, the weight of realization settling over him. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Back there." Her gaze didn't waver. "Because men say the truth when they think I cannot hear it," she replied quietly. "And because pretending kept me alive." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Caleb swallowed, nodding once in understanding. "You don't have to pretend here," he said. "Not with me." For the first time since he'd seen her on that platform, the tight control in her face loosened, just slightly. Not a smile. Something deeper. Something like relief. Morning came softly to the ranch, pale light slipping through the thin curtains and settling over the worn wooden floor. Caleb had been awake for hours, sitting at the small kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd forgotten to drink. His thoughts moved in slow circles, always returning to the same point. The sound of her voice in the doorway, the careful way she'd chosen each word, the truth she'd trusted him with. He wasn't sure when responsibility had turned into something heavier, but he felt it now, steady and unignorable. She appeared in the doorway just after sunrise, hair loosely tied back, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She paused when she saw him watching, as if bracing for something. Caleb straightened, suddenly aware of how silence could feel like a test. "There's bread," he said, pointing. "And eggs. Help yourself." She nodded and moved around the kitchen with quiet confidence, taking in the space, the sounds, the way the floorboards creaked under her steps. Caleb noticed how her head tilted slightly now and then, the way her eyes filled in what her ears might miss. When she sat across from him, there was no fear in her posture, only caution sharpened by experience. "I won't tell anyone," Caleb said after a while. "About your hearing. That's yours to share. Or not." She studied his face as if searching for the smallest crack of deception. "Most men would use it," she replied calmly. "They would test me, say cruel things to see if I reacted. I'm not most men," he said, not defensively, just honestly. Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "No," she agreed. "You are not." They spoke little that morning, but the silence between them was different from the one she was used to. It wasn't heavy or threatening. It simply existed. After breakfast, she followed him outside without being asked, taking the reins of routine as if it were something she'd been denied for too long. Caleb showed her the toolshed, the fences that needed mending, the horses that responded better to calm hands than force. She listened, watched, remembered. Days unfolded with a quiet steadiness. She worked because she chose to, not because she was ordered. When she tired, she rested. When she had questions, she asked them directly, her voice low but sure. Caleb paid her wages anyway, setting the money aside even when she tried to refuse. "You earned it," he said simply. "Choice doesn't erase work." At night, they sat on the porch as the sky darkened and the stars came out one by one. Caleb talked more than he had in years. About the land. About his sister, who had left home and never returned. About the loneliness that crept in when the days grew too quiet. She listened, sometimes catching every word, sometimes only the shape of them, but always the meaning. Once, a neighbor stopped by to talk about cattle prices. He glanced at her and smirked, speaking louder than necessary. "Quiet one you got there. Must be nice." No backtalk. Caleb felt her shoulders stiffen beside him, just for a moment. Before he could speak, she met the neighbor's gaze and said evenly, "I hear enough to know when a man confuses silence with stupidity." The neighbor flushed and left quickly. Caleb stared at her, surprise flickering into something like pride. "You didn't have to do that," he said once they were alone. "I wanted to," she replied. "Here, I can." The storm came a week later, rolling in fast and sudden, the sky darkening as if night had fallen early. Wind rattled the windows, and thunder cracked overhead without warning. She froze, hands flying to her ears, breath hitching as if the world had tipped sideways. Caleb was beside her instantly, not touching, just present, his voice low and steady. "You're safe," he said. "I'm here." They waited it out together, the house creaking but holding, the noise fading into distance. When her breathing finally slowed, she let her hands fall. "I don't hear thunder like others," she said quietly. "It doesn't come in pieces. It comes all at once." Caleb nodded, understanding more than the words alone conveyed. "Then we'll face it together," he said. "One sound at a time." As summer leaned toward autumn, the contract lay forgotten in a drawer, its ink fading in importance with each passing day. She knew she could leave. Caleb had told her so more than once. Freedom meant nothing if it wasn't real. One evening, as the fields turned gold and the air grew crisp, she stood beside him at the fence line, watching the cattle settle. "I pretended to be deaf to survive," she said. "But pretending costs something too." Caleb didn't rush to answer. "You don't owe me anything," he said at last. "Not truth. Not staying." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if measuring a future she'd never been allowed to imagine. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still here." The realization settled gently between them. Not a promise, not a claim, just a shared understanding. The ranch was still quiet, the world still imperfect, but for the first time, neither of them felt truly alone.